I'm very happy to be the last one in this session because there is some similarity in themes that emerge, and considering that this session is on MOOC discussion forums, it's kind of nice to know that we are all looking at similar themes, doing them probably slightly differently. So I'm from the University of South Australia. I'll be talking about the work we've done with Shane Dawson on the data that comes from Delft University of Technology, taking one MOOC as a case. The interest that I personally have with all of this is to understand student relationships and how these evolve in scaled courses. Because we know from educational research that student relationships formed via in-class interactions can lead to improved academic performance, resilience, satisfaction, sense of belonging in their course of study. Now the question is, when we look at the scaled courses, the learners usually complain with all the complexity and chaos overtaking them. So what is the impact of scale on how people can relate to each other within a course? And there are plenty of constructs that educational research has offered so far. For example, social presence, strong ties, learning community, sense of trust, community of practice, belonging and identity. No problem, just take a construct and try to figure out so what's happening in a MOOC. The problem with those is that most of these constructs come from non-MOOC contexts. And just to take a concept that was developed in a classroom with 15 people where everybody showed up on the first day, showed up every time, and then left on the last day, and all of them went for the degree in some ways, is a little bit off when we apply that to a course where people drop in and out even in the last week of the course, showing possibly similar motivations, but the diversity of these is so big. So we encounter this problem of context and transfer when we use theoretical constructs. Now, because we wanted to see the potential for relationships in scale courses, we looked at all these constructs, and the thought was, well, all of these assume that the people were present and continuously interacted with each other. So how does that translate in MOOC forums? How often do people actually meet? Same people? How many people does one meet in a MOOC forum, if I were to use this word? And there's a lot of stuff that has been done, really good stuff about engagement patterns. But the problem is that engagement patterns of MOOC learners are either not explicit as to which subgroups, like there's no integration between the engagement pattern in a MOOC and student behavior in a forum on the one hand, and on the other hand, when you look at forum-specific studies, they don't really go back. So it's almost like all the forum analysis and all the engagement patterns are just two separate things. In order to get insight into what we wanted to do, we looked at a group of people that was defined by a regularity of participation. That's why I asked a question about regularity, because I was curious. We used a metric for that, which was participating, making a post in any 3 weeks or more. 3 weeks could be first week and 2 last ones, not necessarily each week one after another. And this measure ignores the number of posts made. It just means making a post at a certain week. So 3 or more weeks. Then it also, another criterion was the timeliness of replying, meaning that if you replied to somebody's question that was asked in week 1, but you did in week 6, we actually didn't consider that a connection. Only if the answer was given within a week, that was basically motivated by the course design and the fact that lectures and quizzes appear at the beginning of the next week. And the last one was the mutuality of interaction, meaning if somebody made 3 posts in 3 weeks, but nobody ever replied to them, we didn't consider that either because of the focus on relationships. And we asked very simple questions. So a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about is quite qualitative. The questions were, how does the network of regular forum participants compare to the overall MOOC cohort? Then what is the content that's co-produced by these regular participants? And the third one was basically we tried to do some the question was, do structural learner characteristics based on their position in the entire cohort's network and the conversation types that they have co-produced define the formation of the network within which they find themselves? The actual data comes from the course on solar energy. It was run in 2013. It was a large MOOC. It had almost 60,000 registrants, and over 2,700 were certified, ran for 8 weeks. Over 14,000 people clicked on a forum at least once, clicked meaning they viewed or posted, just general to give you a scale indicator. There were 17,000 forum posts made not only within those 8 weeks, because we only analyzed the 8 weeks of the course. All people who made at least one forum post were almost 6,000. Now, people posting in 3 or more weeks, that would be just the regularity criterion, were 582 people. People who engaged in timely reciprocal interactions for 3 or more weeks, the ones that we're looking at, were 255. And I'll just add a metric here, is that people who made a post, we don't know how many, in every week of the course were 12. And I want to emphasize that I've seen data from other courses, and it's always the same, 12 to 20. So people who made a post every week is a very small group of people. So first, how does a network of regular forum participants compare to the overall MOOC cohort? Basically nothing new. That network grows over time, so more people start posting. Their degree grows, accumulates, so they manage to meet each other over time. The peak of activity somehow falls on 3/4 and goes slightly down, I don't know. And then the frequency of the encounters, and I'm talking about the edge weight, so the number of times 2 same people met, is not very high except for the top 25% and outliers, who are the hyperposters, and we have a lot of work on those done. So this is just a quick, this is the degree distribution for the regular participants. So this is same group of people, that's the entire network. So this is kind of like a Russian doll, you know, the one that's a part of that network somehow. The stages over time, these are not aggregated ones. The stages are based on the course design, so assessment, because as Tobias was saying, if you go 1 week, that's too small. People drop in not necessarily every week. If you do, I think what I found, if you do 3 or 4 weeks, that may be too large, but based on the course design, so by assessments, is more or less okay to see how often people come back. So here we see that the aggregated mean for this network is much higher, meaning that these people keep bumping into each other and talking with each other. And unfortunately, the number of times 2 same people meet is still not very high, even for those who participate regularly. We're talking about twice, 2.5 times, but that is with outliers removed. So the top quartile and the outliers talk to each other on average, well, 6, 7, 8, 20, 15, 30, up in this course up to 157. I have in a different course it's 400 times. So there is a maximum number of times that 2 people talk, but that's not for everybody. I'm taking too much time to talk about this. So we also did one thing is we looked at the positions in the network. And because, as Tobias has illustrated also, these are networks based on co-occurrence and conversations, which basically produces high degree by just very fast and easily and a lot of clicks. So we clustered the learners based on their betweenness and clustering coefficient, and we derived 4 clusters, and I just wanted to illustrate those. So cluster 1 and cluster 2. Cluster 2 is just 8 people, so these are the hyperposters, and cluster 1 is 32 people. They are characterized by high betweenness and low clustering coefficient, so high participation in a lot of threads. They are different clusters because the degree of these differs between them significantly. And the other 2 are cluster 3 and cluster 4, so we're talking about most of the regular participant network. And I just wanted to point out, because that's important for later, is that a lot of the green stuff, you know, somehow when I visualized that, I thought, well, what is this cluster 1? Why are there so many of them? And I will come back to that later. So second part of the question was, what is the content that these guys have produced together? And I have annotated forum posts based on the following scheme. Some of them were content related, but we went a little bit further than just content related, so related to the task, quiz, exam, lab, etc., or related to the non-task. So is it about a lecture or interest-based? Because it's a solar energy course, people were talking about how can I make a solar panel in my backyard? What is the best? And this is not related to the course curriculum as provided by the teacher, but it's related to the course content as such. And then we also looked at the social posts. when this was done, it was treated as 2, but if you find this in any way interesting, I do suggest treating the social post as 1. My judgment today is like that. But at that point, social task means person's reflection on his or her ability to interact with the course. So somebody will say, well, this was very difficult, but I tried really hard and I did it, and no expectation from anybody else. Social non-task differs, so some of them are expectations from the course, some of them are feedback to the instructor, and the ones that I think are most fascinating are the social negotiations ones, is when MOOC learners start making sense of what's happening in the course. There were also other categories that emerged, administrative and technical issues, so when is the course deadline, can I still submit? Or your submit button doesn't work, kind of questions. And then metacognitive things, so how do I learn in a MOOC, how do you prepare for the exams, very specific learning strategy oriented, and then mixed where we couldn't figure out which one of these is the one. So this is qualitative coding of 986 conversations, which is over 3,000 posts. The interactive reliability was 0.7. 2 coders did the work. I'm not looking at the number of posts for each category, so it's different, but I'm looking at different course stages. And what it shows is that the cognitive task, so the quiz, lab, exam posts, grow over time for the regular participant network. And the content non-task, so the interest-based conversations, are likely to be the highest at the very first week of the course and at the very last week of the course. And I've seen, it's a similar pattern across the other courses I've seen. The social negotiation or social non-task posts and conversations are at highest in the first week. And these, if I build a bipartite network of the learners and the conversations, the central conversations to which regular learners contributed would also be social non-tasks, so social negotiations ones. We don't have a lot of them in a MOOC. If you have 5 or 10, that would be great, but this is where most people who regularly participated would show up and say something in one place. And then that would be the week 3 or 3/4, 3/4, 3/4 of the course. Cognitive tasks, that's when the content gets really difficult. You don't have a lot of people there, but it really, they need to get together and talk more because it gets, well, they want to finish and they want to invest. And then sometimes it's the informational posts or the technical ones in the first in the first week, because things don't work and people are trying to build together as to how to make things work. So what we did next is that we did statistical modeling of this bipartite network of regular participants, we modeled the main effects. So for those who are not familiar with ERGM, so ERGM, what it does is that takes the features, this small patterns of the network, and then it produces a distribution of networks based on the features you give, and then it compares that you compare the distribution to the network you have to make a judgment as to whether what is being modeled actually is of any importance. So I wanted to see the main effect, whether it differed, whether there were some specific kinds of conversations that were driving this, and no, not for the entire course, something that's not in the paper, but we also did that for different stages, and it's not the same story there. The conversations that are driving the network are more specific for each stage of the course. Then, are there any type of clusters, so any kind of users, learners, participants that are driving the network formation? And cluster 2, so those, the hyperposters, is very high influence on the network formation. Cluster 1, those are the green guys that I showed you before. I have them again. They also have a lot of edges in the network, so they drive the network formation. And then I wanted to understand the homophily between the influential participants, so clearly not the 8 hyperposters, because those talk to everybody as much as possible, but it was more interesting to see what about these green guys, this cluster that's characterized by high betweenness and low clustering coefficient, but not as big as for the hyperposters. And yes, there is some homophily for them. And we also looked at whether some of these influential nodes, so cluster 1 and cluster 2, co-occur in certain conversations, and you can read the results in the paper because I'm almost done with time. It's there. No, it is really there. It's not very interesting. I think what's interesting is that we should be looking at people who participate regularly. Maybe the metrics are not, maybe the granularity is coarse, but the reality is that even those occasional people that Tobias was talking about, and that's my interpretation of what I think is emerging from your study, is that some people post occasionally, but it doesn't mean that they don't use the forum regularly, because there's a group of people who log in all the time and make 1 or 2 posts. So we need to understand this continuity of interactions in a MOOC forum to understand better how we can facilitate the relationships. And also these social negotiation threads are central. They don't always occur in the beginning of the course. Sometimes in some courses, depending on the design, I've seen them occur at the very end of the course. So in the future work, what we'd like to do is we'd like to model whether participating in these social negotiation conversations actually makes a difference as to what kind of learner and poster this person will become further on. And then, as trivial as it is, but people who participate regularly and post more, not necessarily hundreds of posts, but just more than 4, actually end up meeting each other more often, and there is more potential for them to interact again. So if course design actually helps people participate more by default, and I'm trying to look at these as physical properties that are aside from the course design, and then we can, if we look at the same iterations over and over, we can actually see whether course design has any impact or how to best design to see these physical properties change. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
That was a very impressive amount of content in a very short period of time. So I think everybody saw there's probably some really exciting and interesting overlaps from our last talk and the first 2. So we have about 5 minutes to ask questions specifically about this project of Sasha, and then we should hopefully have about 5 minutes for any general discussion and cross ties that people want to talk about.
Yeah, thanks very much. I found your initial questions very interesting about how these social competencies go along when you work with online courses. I was wondering actually what happens to the big majority that is not regular, participating in the discussion forums. Is it possible that you have a sort of private community that shares a lot, even about the course, but on Facebook, or that's split away? And could you find out about that?
There is work that's happening that people have looked at other places where conversations are happening and communities are being built. But my interest is not at what happens in people's leisure time. As a teacher, you want to intervene where you can. Like, people just have study groups. You know, with my friends, I can go to the library and create my personal group. The teacher has no influence over that. But if you come to my workshop, I can influence these relationships. So my interest is on these, not necessarily outside. So it's, as a teacher, I don't need to know what happens outside of the class to facilitate relationships. I think that's the logic here, that's why the boundaries are imposed and only what happens in the forum and only what happens in the 8 weeks of course delivery, because conversations continue.
I completely agree with you. It's out of your influence. But if I want to explain to someone that online courses are not that bad because not all these social things go down the drain, and then I have to tell them that only 10% interact, I would actually be happy to know what the other ones do, and then tell the critics that, oh, there's much more going on socially, even connected to the course. That's why I would be interested in what happens outside.
I don't think I know how to answer that. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I don't think that what I've done it can inform that question in any way.
It's not a question, more a suggestion. So this MOOC, if I remember from Delft, was still in the old session base. Like every week there is something to do and new videos and so on. And now we struggle with the new models from Coursera and edX. Coursera is called On Demand, it's always on. At X it's called self-space, but it would be extremely interesting if you could use your methods to show the difference of participation in these two models, the timely, the weekly one, and the always on. We're not very happy with this evolution of Coursera. We don't have strong evidence to prove that it's not good, but that would be a highly cited paper if you could prove something like that.
If I can just make a comment, is that another course that I have analyzed didn't have assessment that one needed to participate to get a final grade. So first 4 or 5 weeks were free of assessment that you have to engage. And the differences that emerge between these kind of course design and there, in these two cases, okay, I'm just looking at very specific cases, is that these networks are much more centralized. The ones that I've analyzed, the ones where the assessment is back-to-back, where the instructor controls basically the pace, you get the hyperposters emerging very early, and then they control the network, and the network becomes even more controlled, but the indicators are much higher by the end of the course there. But the distributed, the network where the assessment is loose is much more distributed. And I don't know whether it's just specific to the two cases I looked at, because again, I don't know that, but that's just, thank you.
We have another question. I was just going to say something in response to Pierre's point, which is that we also need to start looking at what these discussions are doing beneficial for learning, whether it's question answering and asking, or it's a community inquiry model. So it's not just showing that, I agree, when you're going to the self-paced model, you're not going to get the same connections, people aren't going to be connected. But we also need to see how that's valued in the pedagogical model, if there is one that is happening in these courses, because it's part of the value proposition that we need to make.
Yes, I was wondering how to interpret your, was it cluster 2, right? The high betweeners, low clustering coefficient. Very interesting finding. So I would interpret the high betweeners. I mean, this is a big MOOC. I mean, this is anonymous. So why would you find this betweener? So because I would guess because of spreading over semantic diversity, or say topical diversity, or would that be the interpretation of the high betweenness?
I think it's much more simple, because the way the network's built is based on the thread participation. So basically I have co-occurrence networks, especially in the early stages. 30 people may be a part of one conversation, which basically makes a lot of noise in terms of social network analysis. So betweenness with clustering goes away from that, the combination of the two in my mind. And then the high betweenness, basically the more conversations you participate in.
So it's like hopping from, you would hop between different threads, or?
Well, you contribute to different conversations, rather, because when you say thread, I think, well, there are many conversations in a thread. Well, conversation is a solid piece of one point being evolved. So it's just basically, what you call it? It's the volume of participation. There's really, I think there's nothing more there. They just participate more.